Hello everyone, welcome to our Module 8 lecture video on using language. And so in this video, we're really going to be talking about that style canon of rhetoric that we discussed when we were talking about the ancient history of rhetoric, and Aristotle developed his 5 canons. This lecture falls under developing our style. So this is before our delivery. We can plan out how to use our language effectively for an oral communication style and for our audience. So this one won't be too long, so stick with me. As you can see, there's only 8 slides here today. And your chapters in your book really do a great job of going into detail about how to use an effective oral style and communication language within your speech. So if you have any questions, please let me know, but we'll go ahead and jump in. So when we're talking about oral style, the important thing to note is that it's completely different from written style, or the way that you would write maybe an English essay, because we are writing for the ear and not for the eye. You cannot go back and reread things or look things up. And so that is why it's important to know the difference between oral communication and written communication. So I've talked about this before. I just talked about this when we were discussing organizing our speeches in the last module, but using more repetition and transitions in your speeches is crucial because, again, like I said, we can't go back and read what you said. We have to have it imprinted on our brain, and so repetition, especially of important points like your thesis statement and your main points, are crucial to establishing that connection with the audience and having them be engaged, and of course having them take away what was important from your speech. Transition words that are really explicit and clear and not, kind of crafty like you would in an English essay are also really crucial because it helps us follow along with our ears where you're going in your speech. I talked about these next 2 in our audience analysis module, but I'll briefly touch on them as well. Using personal pronouns, like I said in that module about audience analysis, helps us establish a connection with the audience. So using we language, like we are all here today to learn about the oral style and oral communication and using language in our speech. So using that we language, you can even use I. So I'd like to talk to you today about X, Y, Z. That's really helpful to establish commonality with your audience, like I mentioned before. Along with that, you want to strive for simplicity. So using simpler terms and fewer words is actually really important when we're communicating in public speaking because, again, we want to appeal to a broad audience. So using those really complicated and impressive words that we would in an essay does not go over very well when we are communicating orally because we don't get to follow along. Maybe we don't know what that word means, and it's harder for us to understand. And you don't have to beef up your speech with a lot of fluff language. Using fewer words helps you be direct, which is a really important part of being a public speaker, is being very direct with your message. And so using fewer words and simpler terms helps you do that. Again, if you do need to use jargon, especially in your briefing speech, if you're briefing us about something that is maybe not known to a lot of people, you can use that jargon, but you definitely need to avoid it if you can, but translate it into simpler language for the rest of us who may not necessarily know what that means. So translating, medical jargon or political jargon and things like that is helpful because, again, you need to be as clear and explicit and simple as possible. So again, try and to use shorter sentences and contractions to help your audience follow what you're saying. It's really easy to ramble on when you're speaking. I'm sure you've noticed me doing it during lectures because I'm not practicing a proper speech, organized that way. I'm trying to teach you the material. But using shorter sentences and contractions such as won't, can't, don't, etc. help you connect with your audience and help them follow what you're saying. Next, we're going to talk about the difference between concrete and abstract language. So using concrete language, which I'll describe in a second, is very effective for public speaking because they are specific, tangible, definite words that hold a lot of meaning. So this is describing things, color, um, senses, so anything that you can basically use your senses, so sight, you can hear, taste, smell, see, things like that. Those were not all five, but you get the gist. So if you're using your senses for something, that is concrete language. So it is warm and bright outside today is an example of using concrete language because warm is something you can feel, that's touch. Bright is something with your eyes, you can see. Definite words help paint a picture and illustrate for your audience. So if you're trying to describe something, make sure that you're using really specific concrete language, especially when you're telling a story. We need those concrete details to help us follow and imagine what you're saying because again, in oral style, everything is up here. So we need to hear it and process it and create a picture in our minds. So abstract, on the other hand, is language that is general and non-specific. It's open to interpretation. So a lot of politicians use abstract language when describing their policies. It's not necessarily concrete, tangible, and specific. So words like freedom and liberty and pride, things like that, that you can't, use any of your senses to describe or to feel really, is an example of abstract language. So if you're talking about an abstract concept, that's not as effective to listeners because, again, if a politician was just talking about how freedom is a really important virtue because of X, Y, and Z, that's something a lot of people can get behind because it's kind of vague and, again, abstract. So try and be, again, really specific with your language when you're describing something because it helps your audience visualize what you're trying to say. Again, I want to note that abstract language is open to interpretation, like I said, so that may not get your message across effectively the way that you are attempting to encode that message. They may decode that message entirely differently if you're using abstract language. Vivid imagery, so this again goes back to what I was saying about concrete language. This helps paint a picture. So offer vivid imagery in your speeches. It brings the senses into play, like I said. Try modifying nouns with descriptive adjectives. So if you were talking about, let's give an example of a baseball game that you were going to play. Let's say this was in your introduction speech. Describe what it smelled like, describe what it felt like, say that it was, an excruciatingly hot day, modify those nouns, specific nouns with descriptive adjectives. So again, the girl was, mean, or I don't know, things like that. So also always use active verb forms. So this is something that's really helpful in our speeches because we always want the subject to be performing the action. I know I feel like we're going back to a 4th grade grammar lesson, but you always want the subject to be performing the action. So an example of this would be, I graded your speeches. Now the passive form of that sentence would be, the speeches were graded. Who were the speeches graded by? I don't know. It wasn't answered in that sentence. So if I say the speeches were graded, it leaves the audience wondering who graded the speeches, if it mattered. I mean, it just leaves it, again, open-ended. So it's really direct and to the point if you use active verb forms and active verbs in your sentences. If you have questions about that, that's a quick Google talking about how to use active verb forms. This is also important to use in your essays, so it's actually the same for written communication and oral communication. So it's just always more clear and direct to use that active verb form. Okay, so now to the very, very long list of figures of speech. So using figures of speech is really important in your public speaking endeavors and in your speeches because, again, it helps paint a picture, it helps connect with your audience, it adds style, it adds creativity. You want all of those things to be a part of your speech because it makes them more interesting. So again, similes can be, I hope you know what a lot of these mean. We'll go through them. They're listed everywhere. So I'm not going to go through this whole list because that would take a long time, and I know you all are very intelligent college students. So a simile is obviously comparing something with like or as. So again, this would help with jargon. If you were comparing something to something else, that would be helpful there. Having metaphors and extended metaphors in your speech is a beautiful way to illustrate a point. It's a great way to incorporate supporting material. All of these are effective ways to, again, add creativity and style to your speech. So I'm not going to go through all of them, like I said, but if you are not sure what one of them means, again, a quick Google. They are in your readings, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. I just wanted to say that using figures of speech is not bad. We should do it because it connects with your audience and, again, helps create and paint that picture. Okay, you also want to build credibility and always use words appropriately. So make sure that you use words that match the occasion that you're talking about. So the example that I always use is it would not be appropriate whatsoever to incorporate humor into a eulogy at a funeral. So that's a really extreme example. But just make sure the language that you choose is appropriate for the occasion. If you're at a really somber event or even a really lively, energetic event, if you were at a really lively, energetic event and attempted to give a really somber speech, that would not fit the tone of the occasion. So make sure to read the room. That goes back to audience analysis and to read the occasion, really. And match formality also. So refrain from using slang and really casual language when giving a professional presentation because that will decrease your credibility greatly. In this class, it's okay to use some language that is relevant to all of us since we're all relatively the same age, but it still obviously needs to be professional since it is a classroom environment and you're not just, hanging out with friends, you're giving a graded presentation. So make sure, again, you're formal, but again, you can go to the other side of the spectrum with that as well. If you were at a really casual meeting maybe or a get-together and you were getting up to give a toast and your speech was really rigid and formal and you were using a lot of strict language, that would not match the formality of the occasion. You should be more laid back, use more slang in that sense. Use code switching selectively. So code switching again refers to the use of dialect and switching back and forth between ways that you speak. I am sure that you speak differently to your significant other's parents than you do to your friends, right? So that's a code switch. The way that you speak, the way that I speak to you all is, again, a little bit of a code switch from the way that I speak to my friends, which is okay. That is a good thing that has to happen because it's important to the occasion and to the formality of the speech. It creates images of friendliness, nostalgia, and honesty. It makes sure it, again, helps you connect to the audience. It again, unites you all as one. It makes everyone feel comfortable if you are in the same space and you're code switching to match that space. And it helps ensure that your meaning is clear. Because again, if I was communicating with you all the way that I make it sound like I communicate horribly with my friends, but let's say I did communicate in a really outrageous way with my friends and I spoke like that with you all, that would create uneasiness, uncertainty. It would destroy my credibility as an instructor. It would create a weird boundary and relationship between us. So it's important to help ensure your meaning is clear, but also to establish a comfort level. And again, this is important in, I'm talking about public speaking settings, and so this is just helpful information. Code switching has also been referenced, in different racial spaces, and I'm not necessarily saying at all that, African American people have to code switch to be like white people and that's the only way that it's going to be acceptable and things like that. I'm not talking about that here. I'm talking about it in an academic sense when we are in a professional setting and code switching to, again, connect with your audience in a certain formal professional environment. Okay, also make sure you use your words accurately. Misuse of words can cause the audience to lose confidence in you. This happens again. I love using political examples, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. But if a politician uses a word incorrectly, it's immediately called out, they're immediately made fun of, and it's hard to recover from that. It decreases your credibility. So make sure you know the definition of the words that you're using, and also make sure you're pronouncing them correctly, especially since we're speaking for the ear. It's really hard to get away with a mispronunciation of a word. So make sure you look those up. Take some time. Again, this goes back to using simple language in our speeches. If you don't know what a word means, you should not be using it in your speech. And so, again, just make sure to double check that because that really can destroy your credibility. Also, again, I already talked about this to use active verbs, but make sure you're using the active voice and active verbs in that. Make your statements clear and assertive. This just goes back to what I was saying earlier in the lecture. Subject performs the action. Passive verb is subject is active upon. We already discussed that, so if you missed it, you can go back, rewind. That's the great thing about mediated communication. Use culturally sensitive and gender-neutral language. I talked about this a little bit again when we talked about audience analysis, but you should definitely respect every different kind of audience member you may even potentially have. So don't assume the makeup of your audience. You should, again, analyze your audience as much as you can beforehand, but make sure that your speech is tailored appropriately to a group of people. Not all cultural beliefs are the same, or gender stereotypes are accurate. Obviously, they're not whatsoever. Different cultural norms for people's families based on what they grew up in are different, and obviously traditions are different. So just be sensitive to your entire audience. All of us are probably very different in what we believe, which is totally okay. But using language that could be offensive to other people gets us in trouble, and again, destroys your credibility and again, alienates your audience members, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to do when you're public speaking. You want to be inclusive, you want to use inclusive language and gender-neutral language. I've been really working on my use of you guys because that is gender exclusive, and so I've been working on that, so you all should too. I can't think of anything else for culturally sensitive and gender-neutral language, but hopefully for all of us in this class, you are all very respectful, and so just keep that up. And then finally, building a lasting impression. You can use repetition, like I said, it's really important, but you can also use it to create and maintain a rhythm. It implants important ideas in listeners' heads. This is really why we do the preview of the main points and the review of the main points in the same order, because it creates a rhythm that's harder to forget. So this is important to use if you want to use similar voice inflections. The way that you preview your main points can be the same way that you restate your main points at the end of your speech. Again, it creates a kind of jingle without a melody in your head that you will be able to take away as an audience member. So these next two definitions are really important. These show up a lot on quizzes too. Anaphora is a repeating word or phrase at the beginning of successive phrases, clauses, or sentence. So a really good, very overused, but good, great example of an anaphora would be I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King. So at the beginning of many different paragraphs, he states, I have a dream, and then he goes on to state his point, and then he says, I have a dream, and he states his next point. So that would be at the beginning of successive phrases, and that also works for sentences as well. And epiphora goes at the end of successive statements. So it's basically the same as anaphora, except it would be like if Martin Luther King said the sentence and then ended with, I have a dream. So those are different and important to help create a lasting impression for your audience. Again, that is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is one of the most famous and rewatched and re-listened to speeches of all time because he uses really great language and style in his delivery, and using that anaphora is very obviously effective because we're still talking about it today. So a great way to remember the difference between anaphora and epiphora is A comes before E. So just remember the A is first, so it's at the beginning of the sentence, and an E is after, so at the end. You can also use alliteration for a poetic musical rhythm. So an alliteration is repeating sounds in neighboring words and syllables. So alliteration is saying the little, wow, I can't think of one at the moment. Give me a second. The mom made meatloaf is an example of an alliteration that you may not necessarily use in a speech. I should have planned that one out. That's my bad. But an alliteration just offers a poetic musical rhythm when you use the same consonants at the beginning of each word in a sentence. So hopefully we've learned about that before in English, so that's why I hadn't pre-thought of an example there. But I hope that this helps a little bit start to developing your style of your speeches. And if you have any questions or can't find the definition of one of those figures of speech, let me know. I will definitely help craft those for you. If you help, not for you, but with you. And if you need help developing this in your specific speech, again, I am more than happy to look over outlines, give you tips of how to incorporate style into your specific speech. I've done this a lot, and I want you all to succeed and incorporate great amounts of style and creativity. So if you have any questions, let me know. But if not, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.